What we are watching right now in the Middle East is not just another round of retaliation. It is not just another headline about missiles, drones, airstrikes, and military threats. What is unfolding is something far more dangerous: the collapse of the old limits that used to keep this conflict from spinning fully out of control. The usual choreography is breaking down. The private warnings are no longer working. The public messaging is no longer aligned. And behind the scenes, the alliance that was supposed to project strength and coordination is starting to show cracks under the pressure. Because this crisis is not only about Israel and Iran, it is also about Washington. It is about the growing reality that the United States and Israel may no longer be operating from the same strategic playbook, even while standing on the same side of the battlefield. One side believes escalation can restore deterrence. The other fears escalation could trigger exactly the kind of regional explosion that nobody can contain once it starts. That is the real story here. Not simply who fired first, or who hit what target, but whether the two most important allied actors in this confrontation still agree on what victory even looks like. According to reporting built around U.S. intelligence assessments and discussions between American and Israeli officials, Washington was deeply alarmed by the possibility of Israel launching a major retaliatory strike against Iran after Tehran's unprecedented drone and missile barrage. That alarm was not rooted in sympathy for Iran. It was rooted in cold strategic calculation. American officials reportedly feared that a large-scale Israeli response would do two things at once. First, it would give the Iranian regime exactly what it desperately needed: a patriotic rallying moment that could silence internal dissent and unite the population behind the leadership. Second, it could ignite panic in global energy markets and send oil prices surging, dragging the world economy into another shock at the worst possible moment. And that is what makes this so explosive. Washington was not just worried about bombs falling in the region. It was worried about political blowback, economic fallout, and the risk that a tactical response could become a strategic disaster. In other words, the White House was looking at the board several moves ahead. A dramatic Israeli strike might look strong in the immediate aftermath, but if it ended up strengthening the Iranian regime at home while destabilizing energy prices abroad, then it would not be a victory. It would be a self-inflicted setback dressed up as resolve. That reportedly led to intense American pressure on Israel to hold back. The message from Washington was blunt. Yes, Israel had the military capability to strike. Yes, the intelligence existed. Yes, there were high-value targets on the table. But capability does not mean wisdom. The Americans, by this account, were effectively saying that just because you can hit the target does not mean you should. The information was meant to function as deterrence, a reminder of what Israel could do if absolutely necessary, not an invitation to launch a chain reaction that no one could control. But in Jerusalem, the same facts produced the opposite conclusion. For Israeli leaders and military planners, especially after absorbing a direct Iranian barrage, the question was not whether escalation was risky. Of course it was. The question was whether failing to respond decisively would be even riskier. From that point of view, restraint does not look like maturity. It looks like weakness. And weakness, in the logic of deterrence, is an invitation. Israeli officials reportedly viewed a measured retaliatory strike not as reckless escalation, but as a way to reestablish consequences. Their message was simple: if Iran can launch hundreds of projectiles toward Israel and emerge without a painful response, then the regional balance changes in Tehran's favor. That is the central split. Washington sees the danger of overreaction. Israel sees the danger of underreaction. Washington fears a wider war. Israel fears the erosion of deterrence. Washington wants to contain the fire. Israel believes the fire spreads when your enemies stop fearing the cost of provoking you. Both sides think they are preventing disaster, but they're defining disaster in completely different ways. That disagreement moved from theory to reality when Israel launched what was described as a limited strike near Isfahan. Israeli officials framed the operation as a calibrated signal, not an all-out assault. It was presented as a narrow, precision-driven demonstration of capability, a reminder to Tehran that Israel could reach sensitive targets inside Iranian territory if it chose to do so. This was not marketed as regime change warfare. It was marketed as a warning shot, carefully designed to communicate vulnerability without immediately forcing a massive counterattack. And yet, even that limited strike carried enormous significance. Once you cross the threshold of direct state-on-state signaling on Iranian soil, the old rules begin to collapse. The conflict is no longer confined to shadow operations, deniable sabotage, proxy warfare, or distant theaters like Syria and Lebanon. It becomes more direct, more visible, and more psychologically charged. It tells everyone in the region that the boundaries have shifted. Iran's public reaction only added to the volatility. On one hand, state-linked messaging initially tried to minimize the incident, downplay the damage, and imply that nothing of strategic importance had happened. On the other hand, military-linked voices threatened devastating retaliation and warned that aggression against Iran's critical infrastructure would not go unanswered. That dual messaging was not confusion. It was calculation. Tehran wanted to avoid looking weak without committing itself too quickly to an escalatory path it might later regret. So it attempted to speak in two registers at once, calm enough to avoid panic, threatening enough to preserve deterrence. But this is what makes these moments so unstable. When both sides are trying to project control while also threatening retaliation, miscalculation becomes far more likely. Every statement is read for hidden meaning. Every limited strike risks being interpreted as a rehearsal for something larger. Every effort to avoid appearing weak can accidentally corner leaders into taking even bigger risks. And that is only one layer of this crisis. Because over the same period, a much broader dispute has been taking shape between Washington and Tel Aviv over Gaza, over military endgames, and over what deterrence means in a region already saturated with trauma, rage, and geopolitical exhaustion. For years, the U.S.-Israel alliance has been described as ironclad. But ironclad alliances can still crack under pressure when the two sides begin pursuing different political outcomes with the same military tools. Washington's growing frustration is not simply about public relations or humanitarian criticism. It is about strategy. There is a widening sense inside parts of the U.S. establishment that military force, when used without a realistic political endpoint, can become counterproductive. The images coming out of Gaza have not just produced moral outrage, they have eroded America's diplomatic position, inflamed regional anger, and made it harder for Washington to keep broader coalitions together. From the Israeli point of view, however, outside lectures about proportionality sound detached from the reality of October 7th and the security trauma that followed. Israeli leaders in Netanyahu's orbit have insisted that partial measures, symbolic operations, and temporary pauses do not solve the fundamental problem. In their view, anything short of crushing Hamas and degrading the wider Iranian proxy network leaves the country exposed to another catastrophe. That is why American calls for restraint are often heard in Israel not as strategic sophistication, but as pressure to accept permanent insecurity. This argument reached a boiling point around Rafah. The White House signaled that a major operation there would cross a line, especially with enormous numbers of displaced civilians packed into the area. Biden moved further in public than many expected, openly criticizing the idea. But Netanyahu responded with open defiance, signaling that Israel would move forward if it believed national security required it. That was not just a policy disagreement. It was political theater. It showed the world that the American president and the Israeli prime minister were not merely negotiating privately. They were now sending competing messages in public. That matters because public defiance changes the terms of alliance management. It tells regional actors that U.S. leverage may be weaker than advertised. It tells adversaries that allied coordination might be fraying. And it tells domestic audiences on both sides that the relationship is no longer a seamless front, but a site of struggle in its own right. At the same time, Iran has been escalating its own rhetoric and widening the scope of its warnings. Iranian officials have signaled that attacks on energy infrastructure will not be treated as isolated incidents. They are being framed as acts of war against the country's economic lifelines. That framing is crucial because it expands the logic of retaliation. Once oil and gas infrastructure become legitimate targets in the eyes of decision makers, the conflict no longer threatens only soldiers, bases, or command centers. It threatens the arteries of the global economy. And Iran knows exactly where the pressure points are. Tehran does not need to defeat the United States or Israel in a conventional head-to-head war to impose enormous costs. It simply needs to make the region economically unmanageable. It needs to convince markets that shipping lanes are unsafe, that production facilities are vulnerable, that insurance costs will spike, that supply can be disrupted, and that every day of continued confrontation carries a new premium of uncertainty. In a world still deeply dependent on stable energy flows, that threat is powerful. It is not abstract. It is measurable in price spikes, volatility, inflation, political anger, and global anxiety. That is why American officials are so worried about the oil dimension of this confrontation. A missile exchange is terrifying enough, but a coordinated campaign targeting regional energy infrastructure, tanker routes, or offshore gas facilities could generate a shockwave that reaches far beyond the Middle East. It could hammer European recovery, strain Asian importers, increase political pressure in the United States, and scramble the already fragile diplomacy surrounding multiple other global crises. In that scenario, the battlefield expands into every gas station, shipping terminal, and commodity market in the world. And this is where the conflict becomes even more dangerous. The incentives for escalation do not disappear just because the costs are obvious. In some ways, the costs create their own perverse logic. If Iran believes that threatening oil flows gives it leverage, then it has an incentive to make those threats feel credible. If Israel believes that only painful, visible action can restore deterrence, then it has an incentive to keep proving that it can reach deeper and hit harder. If Washington believes that deterrence must be maintained while regional war must be avoided, then it has an incentive to issue warnings without fully breaking with its ally. That means all three actors are operating under pressure, all three are trying to project strength, and all three are trapped inside strategic frameworks that reward brinkmanship. That is what makes this such a textbook case of the security dilemma. Each side interprets its own moves as defensive, and the other side's moves as escalatory. Israel says it is responding to aggression and trying to prevent worse attacks later. Iran says it is defending its sovereignty and economic survival against sabotage and direct strikes. The United States says it is trying to prevent regional collapse while supporting an ally's right to self-defense. None of these positions feels irrational from inside its own worldview. But when all three collide at once, the result is a ladder of escalation that becomes harder to climb down with every passing day. The strike near Isfahan, the retaliatory missile activity linked to Iranian signaling, the warnings around energy infrastructure, the conflict over Rafah, the nervous communications between Washington and Jerusalem, the silence and caution from Gulf states, the market volatility around oil and gas, all of these are not separate stories. They're pieces of the same larger crisis. A crisis in which the old assumptions no longer hold. A crisis in which deterrence is being tested, redefined, and potentially broken. And one of the most overlooked parts of this situation is the role of regional actors who are trying very hard not to get dragged all the way in. Gulf governments have every reason to fear both outcomes. Openly aligning with Israeli escalation risks inflaming domestic anger and inviting Iranian retaliation. Publicly turning against Israel or the United States could fracture quiet security understandings and create new vulnerabilities. So many of them are doing what states do in moments of maximum uncertainty, speaking softly, signaling privately, and hoping not to become the next battlefield. But silence is not stability. It is often a sign that everyone understands how bad the alternatives are. Meanwhile, the danger is multiplied by the sheer number of armed actors who now exist between official command structures and the battlefield itself. Hezbollah, the Houthis, militias in Iraq and Syria, IRGC-linked networks, local commanders with their own initiative, air defense operators on edge, naval units in congested waterways, all of these actors make crisis management harder. A single launch, a misread radar signal, an intercepted drone, a strike that causes unexpected casualties, or a commander acting faster than diplomats can communicate could send the entire situation lurching into a new phase. The more crowded the battle space becomes, the less confidence anyone can have that escalation will remain tidy, limited, or reversible. That is why the phrase controlled escalation is always more fragile than it sounds. Leaders love the idea of calibrated force. They love the fantasy that they can hit just hard enough to send a message, but not so hard that the other side feels compelled to respond beyond a certain threshold. Sometimes that works for a while, but eventually, the messages pile up, the thresholds blur, and the political need to avoid looking weak starts overpowering the strategic need to avoid catastrophe. And that may be exactly where this crisis is heading now. Because what we are seeing is not a path to resolution. It is a transition into a more dangerous condition, a sustained, high-intensity confrontation where everyone keeps saying they want to avoid full-scale war, but everyone keeps taking actions that make full-scale war more likely. The old back channels still exist, but they are weaker. The diplomatic vocabulary still exists, but it has less force. The alliance structure still exists, but it is under strain. The deterrence logic still exists, but each side now interprets deterrence through the lens of humiliation, domestic politics, and survival. And once a crisis reaches that stage, even rational actors can produce irrational outcomes. Not because they are crazy, not because they do not understand the risks, but because they believe the greater danger lies in backing down. Israel fears that restraint will invite future attacks. Iran fears that passivity will invite deeper penetration and more sabotage. Washington fears that a rupture with Israel could weaken deterrence, even as total alignment could drag America into a wider war. All of those fears are real. All of them reinforce each other. And all of them narrow the space for de-escalation. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, the most important takeaway is this. The Middle East is no longer merely facing another episode of tension. It is entering a phase in which the old informal rules are eroding, the alliance system is straining, and the economic consequences of military decisions are becoming just as important as the military consequences themselves. This is why the stakes feel so high. A strike is no longer just a strike. It is a message to adversaries, a test for allies, a signal to markets, a trigger for domestic politics, and a gamble with regional order. Every action now carries 5 or 6 consequences at once. And that is exactly why the room for error is disappearing. Washington wanted to prevent a response that would hand Tehran a patriotic rallying cause and blow open global energy panic. Israel wanted to prove that Iranian attacks carry consequences and that deterrence still means something. Iran wants to show that attacks on its soil and infrastructure will impose costs not only on Israel, but on the wider system that protects Israel. None of these objectives is going away. None of these governments can simply wish away the political logic driving them, which means this conflict is likely to remain trapped in the most dangerous zone of all. Not peace, not all-out war, but a boiling confrontation where every side thinks it is managing risk while actually multiplying it. And that may be the most chilling reality of this moment. There may not be a clean resolution waiting just beyond the next round of diplomacy. There may only be risk management, crisis by crisis, strike by strike, headline by headline, until somebody miscalculates badly enough to shatter what remains of the guardrails. That is the story. Not just missiles and threats, not just leaders posturing on television, not just another temporary spike in regional tension. This is a structural breakdown in restraint, a conflict that is spreading outward militarily, politically, and economically, while the very actors best positioned to stop it are increasingly divided over what stopping it would even require. And if that division keeps deepening, then the next explosion may not come because one side wanted a full regional war. It may come because all sides believe they could get just close enough to the edge without falling over it.